I was legally dead for 9 days. Not metaphorically. Not in the dramatic way people say it after a car accident or a surgery that went close. I mean that a death certificate was filed with the state of Tennessee with my name on it, my date of birth, my social security number, and a cause of death that I only found out about 14 months later when my attorney requested the document during the civil case, and I sat in her office and read the words cardiorespiratory failure next to my name and felt something that I still don't have a word for. Something between laughter and the thing that comes before you decide whether or not to fall apart. My name is Daniel Carr. I'm 41 years old. I'm a high school history teacher and I coach JV soccer, and I have a dog named Pepper and an apartment I've lived in for 3 years and a life that is, from the outside, completely ordinary. People meet me and they don't know. There's nothing about me that signals what happened. I look like a person who has been mostly fine, which is both true and the least true thing I could say about myself. I need to go back to the beginning because the beginning is the only way any of the rest of it makes sense. In February 2 years ago, I drove myself to Hargrove Regional Medical Center at 11:30 at night because I thought I was having a heart attack. I was 39. I had no history of cardiac issues, no family history. I ran 4 days a week and didn't smoke, and my last physical had been 6 months prior, and everything was fine. But I was sitting on my couch grading papers, and something happened in my chest. A pressure, enormous and sudden, spreading into my left arm and up into my jaw, and I knew what it was the way you know some things before your brain has finished the sentence. I called 911, and then I thought about the wait time, and I lived 4 minutes from the hospital, and I drove myself, which the ER doctor later told me was both understandable and extremely inadvisable. I walked into the Hargrove Regional Emergency Department at 11:34 p.m. and told the intake nurse I thought I was having a cardiac event, and she moved quickly, and I was in a bay within minutes, and there were people around me doing the things they do, and I remember the ceiling tiles, and I remember someone asking me my name and date of birth, and I remember giving both, and then I remember nothing. What I know about the next period comes from medical records, from conversations with the doctors involved, from the investigation that followed, and from one source I'll get to later that is the reason I'm recording this at all. I did not have a heart attack. What I had, the cardiologist explained to me 11 months later in a conference room with 2 attorneys present, was a severe vasovagal episode, a sudden drop in heart rate and blood pressure triggered by pain or stress that caused me to lose consciousness. Frightening, occasionally dangerous, not a heart attack, treatable, the kind of thing that, properly identified, would have had me home within 24 hours with a referral and a follow-up appointment. That is not what happened. What happened, as best as anyone has been able to reconstruct it, begins with a man named Kevin Doyle. Kevin Doyle was 38 years old, a mechanic from a town 40 minutes east of the city, who was brought into the Hargrove Regional Emergency Department by ambulance at 11:47 p.m. on the same night I walked in, 13 minutes after me. Kevin Doyle had been in a serious car accident on the interstate. He had no identification on him. His wallet had either been lost in the crash or he hadn't had one. This was never definitively established. He was unconscious and critically injured, and the paramedics who brought him in had pulled his name from a phone in his jacket pocket, an old phone with a cracked screen that had the name Kevin as the contact for his own number. That is what they gave the intake staff. Kevin. No last name. No date of birth. No insurance card. The emergency department at Hargrove Regional was, that night, operating at 140% capacity. This is documented. It was a Saturday night in February, cold, icy roads, a full moon, the combination of factors that fills emergency departments reliably. There were staff who had been on shift for 11 hours. There were patients in the hallway. There were 2 trauma cases ahead of Kevin Doyle's ambulance, and the staff who received him were moving fast. Someone, and this person was never definitively identified despite the investigation, which is its own outrage. Someone attached Kevin Doyle's incoming paperwork to my chart. My name, my date of birth, my social security number that I had given at intake 13 minutes earlier, the man with no identification who had come in by ambulance, and the man who had walked in with full identification and was now unconscious in a bay somewhere in the same building became, in the hospital system, the same person. I don't know exactly when I regained consciousness. The records for this period are, and I will say this as carefully as I can because it is the subject of ongoing litigation, inconsistent in ways that have not been fully explained. What I know is that when I became aware of my surroundings, I was not in the emergency department. I was in a room, a private room, a hospital room, with a window showing darkness and the orange glow of a parking lot. And there were tubes, and there was a monitor, and there was a quality of silence that told me it was the middle of the night. I was confused. This is the charitable way to say it. The more accurate way is that I was profoundly disoriented in the way that people are when they've been unconscious and then medicated and then unconscious again. A disorientation that isn't just not knowing where you are, but not being entirely certain of the boundaries of yourself, where your body ends and the room begins. I tried to speak and produce something that wasn't a word. I tried to move my right arm and found it connected to something. I looked at the ceiling and worked on understanding one thing at a time. After a period I can't accurately estimate, it could have been 20 minutes, it could have been longer, a nurse came into the room. She was young, maybe mid-20s, and she came in looking at something in her hands and didn't immediately look at my face, and when she did look up, she stopped completely. She stared at me for a moment. Then she looked down at what she was holding. Then she looked back at me. She said quietly, "Oh my God, I want to tell you I knew in that moment what had happened." I didn't. I knew something was very wrong. I knew it from the way she looked at me, not with the professional readiness of a nurse encountering a conscious patient, but with something that had no professional frame around it at all, something unguarded and frightened. She left the room. She came back with another nurse, and then a doctor, and they stood at the foot of my bed and looked at me with variations of the same expression, and I said, with the voice I was slowly recovering, that I needed someone to tell me what was happening. What they told me, in pieces, over the next several hours, as more people came and the conversations became more careful and more formal, and eventually involved a hospital administrator who chose his words with the precision of a man who understood he was in serious trouble. What they told me was this. Kevin Doyle had died. He had died approximately 36 hours after arriving at the hospital, of injuries sustained in the crash, despite significant intervention. He had died under my name. The death had been processed under my name. The death certificate had been filed under my name. My emergency contact, my sister Claire, in Nashville, had been called. She had been told that her brother Daniel Carr had died of cardiorespiratory failure at Hargrove Regional Medical Center. I had been in the hospital the entire time, in a room, on the 4th floor, being treated for a vasovagal episode under a different name, under a chart that said Kevin, last name unknown, and that had been flagged as a John Doe case, a man with no identification, whose paperwork would be sorted out when he was stable enough to communicate. I had communicated. I had told nurses my name was Daniel. They had written Daniel in the notes as a possible first name for the John Doe, a detail to be followed up, in a department that was running at 140% capacity on one of the worst nights of the year. My sister had buried me. Not literally. She hadn't been able to arrange a funeral yet. It had only been 9 days. And there had been complications with the death certificate that I would later understand were related to the inconsistencies in my chart and that had delayed things. But she had told people. She had called my parents, who are divorced and live in different states, and she had told both of them. She had called my closest friends. She had contacted my school. She had begun the terrible, specific process of notifying a person's world that they no longer exist. I asked for a phone. There was a long pause before anyone moved to get me one, a pause full of the kind of institutional calculation that I would come to know well in the months following, the pause of people working out liability in real time. Eventually a nurse, the young one who had come in first, whose name I learned was Amber and who I have thought about often since, not with anger, but with a specific complicated feeling. Amber handed me her personal cell phone, and I called my sister. I want to be careful here because what I'm about to describe is something that belongs, in its full form, to Claire and not to me. I'll say only that she answered on the second ring, and I said her name, and there was a silence that I have never heard before or since, and hope I never hear again. A silence that had a specific texture, the texture of a person's entire understanding of reality cracking down the middle. And then she said my name. And then she didn't say anything for a long time. She drove through the night. She was there by 6 in the morning. When she walked into the room and saw me, she stood in the doorway for a moment, and I saw her register that I was real, that I was sitting up in a hospital bed and not a memory. And she crossed the room, and we didn't say anything for a while, and I don't know how long we sat there. The hospital was in full crisis management mode by the time Claire arrived. The administrator had been replaced in the conversations by someone from the legal department, and then by someone more senior from the legal department. And the language in every conversation had become extremely careful and extremely empty simultaneously, a kind of verbal packing material surrounding the actual facts. They were sorry. They were committed to understanding what had happened. They were grateful that I was alive and well. They wanted to ensure that the appropriate notifications were made to correct the records. They used the word notifications for what I would have called telling my parents I wasn't dead, and I noticed this, and I did not say anything, because Claire had squeezed my arm when the legal person started talking, and I understood that she had already made some calls of her own on the drive up. Correcting a death certificate, I learned, is not simple. It involves the State Vital Records Office and the county clerk and the Social Security Administration, and a process that took, in my case, for months and an attorney to complete. For 4 months I was, in various government databases, dead. My Social Security number was flagged as belonging to a deceased individual. My bank account was frozen when the bank system received the death notification. This is automatic, a fraud prevention measure, and no one's fault individually. And it happened the day after I was discharged from the hospital. When I tried to use my debit card at a grocery store, and it was declined, and I stood at the register and understood that this was going to be more complicated than I had thought. I moved into Claire's guest room for 6 weeks while the account situation was resolved. I could not access my apartment. My lease was in my name, and my name was legally attached to a dead person, and the landlord, a decent man who was genuinely distressed about the situation, could not legally allow me to continue occupying the unit until my legal status was clarified, on the advice of his own attorney. I owned a car that I could not legally drive because my license was flagged. I had a job I had to fight to return to because the school district's HR system had processed my death notification, and my position had been posted as vacant, and a substitute had been hired to cover my classes, and the union had to get involved before any of it was resolved. I want to be clear about something. None of the individual people involved in these systems were malicious. The bank was following protocol. The landlord was following advice. The school district was following procedure. Every single thing that happened to me after I was discharged from the hospital was the result of systems doing exactly what they were designed to do, automatically, efficiently, without any human being making a bad decision. The bad decision, the original catastrophic error, had been made by someone in that emergency department who attached the wrong paperwork to the wrong chart, and every subsequent event was just the machinery of modern life running correctly on incorrect information, gears turning smoothly, output perfectly wrong. This is the thing I find hardest to explain to people when they ask about it. They want a villain. They want a person who did something bad on purpose, someone who can be identified and held accountable and made to face consequences, and I understand this desire because I shared it. I shared it intensely for a long time. But the investigation, conducted by the state health department and a private firm hired by the hospital's insurance carrier and eventually by the Attorney General's office, never identified the specific individual who made the initial paperwork error. There were theories. There were candidates. There were staff members who were redeployed or whose contracts were not renewed in the months following. No one was ever charged. The hospitals settled the civil case for an amount I cannot disclose and issued a statement about implementing new patient identification protocols that I read carefully and found technically accurate and thoroughly unsatisfying. Kevin Doyle's family. He had a mother and a younger brother. I know this because my attorney shared some of what came out in the discovery process. Kevin Doyle's family buried him under his own name eventually. They had been told he had no identification on him, that there had been confusion in the initial intake, that the hospital was deeply sorry. What they were not told, as far as I know, is the full shape of the confusion, the way their son and brother had briefly ceased to exist in the hospital's system while his identity was attached to a man on the 4th floor who was recovering from a fainting episode and wondering why no one had contacted his family. I think about Kevin Doyle's family more than I probably should. I never met them and I never will, and that seems right and also insufficient. I went back to teaching in April, 3 months after it happened. My students knew something had occurred, small towns talk, and a teacher's unexplained absence followed by return is noticed, but most of them didn't know the details, and I didn't tell them, and we got on with the curriculum, and the soccer season started, and the ordinary structure of the school year rebuilt itself around me, and I let it. I started having trouble sleeping in May. I want to be accurate about the timeline because I think it matters. I was functional for 2 months before the thing caught up with me. And then it caught up with me all at once on a Tuesday night when I was lying in bed, back in my own apartment with my own account unfrozen and my own license valid again, in a life that had been substantially restored. And I thought about Amber, the nurse's face, when she looked up from what she was holding and saw me in that bed. I thought about that pause, the pause before she understood what she was looking at. And I understood suddenly and completely what I had been in that moment, in that room. I had been a ghost. I had been a dead man lying in a bed, and she had looked at me and seen something that shouldn't be there. And I had not understood this when it was happening, and I understood it now. At 2 in the morning in my own bedroom, and the understanding was not okay. I called the employee assistance line my school district provided and got into therapy in June. My therapist, a man named Dr. Osei, who has a very calm office and asks questions that seem simple until you try to answer them, helped me understand that what I was experiencing had a specific shape, not just the trauma of what happened, but a particular form of it, something related to the dissolution of identity, to having been, however briefly and however erroneously, not a person. Not dead exactly. Something more disorienting than dead. Uncategorized. Existing without existing in the record, in the system, in the network of acknowledgments that constitute, in a modern administrative sense, a life. He said something to me in one of our early sessions that I've thought about often. He said that we tend to think of identity as something internal, something we carry inside ourselves that persists regardless of what the records say. And that's true, he said. But we live in a world that is organized around documentation, around records. And when those records say you don't exist, the world responds as though you don't. And experiencing the world responding to your non-existence while you stand in the middle of it very much alive, is its own specific category of awful that doesn't have a clean name yet. He was right. I've spent a lot of time thinking about what it felt like to try to use a bank card that came back declined because you are dead, to call your landlord and explain that you are not actually deceased, and have him say, kindly, that he believed me, but his attorney had advised him. To walk into the school district's HR office and sit across from a woman who was looking at a file that said deceased next to your name and watch her try to reconcile the file with the person sitting in front of her. Each of these moments was small. Each of them was also a version of the same thing. The world looking through you, around you, past you, because the record said you weren't there. I'm recording this 14 months after it happened, which means 14 months of work to become someone the records agree exists again, 14 months of therapy, 14 months of being asked by people who find out are you okay, and saying yes, which is partially true. I am okay. I am also changed in ways I don't think are going to unchange, which is different from not being okay and which I've decided is something I can live with, because the alternative is spending the rest of my life trying to get back to a version of myself that no longer exists, which is, when I put it that way, its own kind of haunting. The thing I want people to take from this, and I've thought about whether there's anything worth taking, because sometimes things happen and there's no lesson. They're just things that happened. But the thing I keep coming back to is this. The system failed because it assumed I couldn't speak for myself. Every protocol in that emergency department was designed for patients who could communicate, or for patients who couldn't and had ID. I fell into a gap. I had ID. I had communicated. And then I was unconscious and the ID was in a bay somewhere, and the communication had stopped, and someone made one error in a busy hallway, and the gap swallowed me. If you are ever in a hospital, conscious or not, for anything serious, write your name and date of birth and an emergency contact number on your arm. Not your phone, not your wallet. Your arm. Somewhere they will see before they see anything else. It sounds absurd. It sounds like the kind of thing you'd dismiss as paranoid until you've sat in an attorney's office reading a death certificate with your own name on it. And then it sounds like the simplest and most obvious thing in the world. I'm alive. I'm teaching. The soccer team had a good season. Pepper is asleep on the couch while I record this and occasionally makes the small sounds that dogs make when they're dreaming, and I don't know what she dreams about, but I hope it's good. I was legally dead for 9 days. I'm still working out what that means. I don't think I'll ever fully finish.